Major changes in the world's climate are already in progress. Saying it isn't so will not make a difference to what is actually happening. If effective mitigating actions are not taken soon, we will enter a period where the future climate will be very destabilizing for coastal and river cities, for communities close to forests, and for food supplies. We are already seeing movements of refugees where food shortages induced by climate have become a factor. And we are already seeing coastal flooding in places where it has not happened before. The situation is urgent. Adapting to climate change will take time. It can take 30 or more years to implement adaptation measures. The first step in adapting to climate change is to have accurate estimates about what is likely to happen in your area. Let's start by considering sea level rise, which will create some of the first problems in adapting to climate change. This is a map of Boston prepared for an exhibition, Climate Ready Boston, by Sasaki Associates and the Boston Architectural College. The light blue areas are projected to be below sea level by 2050. The darker blue areas dominate the map, are not projected to be below sea level until 2100. However, the problem with the areas below sea level is not just protecting them during ordinary times, but the way the effect of storm surges will be augmented because sea levels are higher. The light blue tone on this map shows that, in the wrong circumstances, a flood surge could cause a catastrophic inundation of the central part of Boston by 2050. 2100 will be worse, but the problems by 2050 will be severe enough to require some kind of comprehensive preventive measure. Miami Beach, built on a barrier island between the Atlantic Ocean and Biscayne Bay, has always had a flooding problem. In the past 10 years, the problems have become worse, so that today, regular high tides at a full moon, called king tides, are causing flooding as well as heavy rainstorms. The west side of Miami Beach, fronting on Biscayne Bay, has the worst flooding problems. This projection by Florida International University shows a map of Miami Beach with the areas below sea level by 2050. If sea level rises 2 feet, the same figure that was used by the Boston maps, 2 feet by 2050 is actually a conservative projection. Many experts are saying it could be worse. This is Bruce Mowry, the chief engineer of Miami Beach, standing beside one of the streets that have recently been raised to keep them dry on days when there is flooding. The city is committed to a capital improvement program costing hundreds of millions of dollars to raise the streets where there are persistent flooding problems. The obvious concern is that property owners along the streets will have to raise their properties as well. Miami Beach has always had a system of pumps to keep it dry, as well as drains that flow into the bay. With sea level rise, the pipes from the pumps and the ends of the other drains going into the bay will be underwater. Some are already underwater during high tides, and water is coming back up the drains into the city. So Miami Beach is replacing or building 70 pumping stations at a cost of hundreds of millions of dollars. These pumps are electric, so they will also have to be equipped with emergency generators, as power is likely to fail during hurricanes, the time when the pumps are most needed. Property values in Miami Beach are high, so there is political support so far for doing what's necessary. But the cost will eventually be higher than utility bills and local taxes can support, and the city will need support from the state and from federal governments. This is a map of New York City showing the directions of potential flood surges, and this is a map of New York City shorelines showing the wide range of different conditions that will need to be planned for to protect the city. The New York City Planning Department has prepared an inventory of implementation measures that will be needed to meet these different conditions. One is raising land and buildings, the strategy that is being followed in Miami Beach. Another strategy is providing flood walls, which can be permanent or moved into place when a flood is expected. This has been a common measure for dealing with floods along rivers. Parks along the waterfront can be redesigned to make them more effective as flood barriers. Where property values are not high enough to support effective government action and conditions make it impossible for individuals to protect their property, then it becomes time for people to move out of the area. The New York document calls this politically very difficult decision planned retreat. In the U.S., the Federal Emergency Management Agency, known as FEMA, has a voluntary buyout program for properties which have flooded regularly and where the cost of the buyout is less than financing reconstruction. This is an example of 2 subdivisions in Austin, Texas, where the residents of a floodplain with recurring water damage are being bought out and their houses demolished and taken away. One of the subdivisions, Onion Creek, is almost completely acquired and demolished, and the second, Yarrabee Bend, is well along towards being cleared. Right now, the streets and house lots of Onion Creek are still there, although the houses have been taken away. Ultimately, the land should be restored to what in this diagram is called a living shoreline, so that the creek and its floodplain resume their natural relationship. The capital cost of building hard protection along a shoreline in a densely populated area can be shared, as shown in this diagram, with other kinds of capital construction, such as a highway. There is a recent real-life example of this strategy being built in Rotterdam. Land that's below sea level can be protected by simple flood walls as long as it is not also subject to powerful flood surges. If there are flood surges, protection then needs to include a regional barrier. Such has been built in the Scheldt Delta in the Netherlands, along the Thames River in London, in St. Petersburg, and is under construction to protect Venice. The geography of Boston Harbor lends itself to a flood barrier. Alternative 3 on this diagram, the outer harbor barrier, which would protect the largest area, is also probably the most effective. Sasaki says that the cost will be $10 billion, a scale of expenditure which would have to come from the national government, like the money expended to rebuild protections in New Orleans, which was about $15 billion. The assessed property value of Boston alone is well above $70 billion, and assessments are lower than market value. And there are also many other parts of the region, like Cambridge, which would also be protected by this barrier. New York City also identified another flood protection technique, appropriate for more rural areas, where land is set aside to fill up with water in case of a flood, a technique learned from the Dutch, who call these places polders. Polders would be especially useful along rivers, where flooding is also expected to increase because of heavier rainfalls related to climate change. We're spending quite a lot of time on flooding relating to climate change because it will soon be a problem for many coastal and river cities. But there are other ways in which it will soon be necessary to adapt to climate change. Let's take a quick look at provisions needed to protect places that have been built too close to forests, which because of climate change have become increasingly likely to burn. Federal law sets up a procedure for creating community wildfire protection plans for places which exist at what is called the wildland-urban interface. This is an example of such a plan in Riverside County, California, west of Los Angeles. The planning area is divided into sub-areas that each have its own specific plan. This is the threat assessment for one of them. And here is the map of the treatment plan for the same area. A combination of changes made in the forest and changes people make to their individual properties to remove vegetation that could burn and to make the building more fire resistant. As the climate changes and more areas of forest become subject to tree die-offs, many more such plans will be needed. Finally, let's look at the relationship between climate change and food insecurity, which is a rather neutral way of describing hunger and potential famine. This map from the UN World Food Program shows the areas of the world where having enough to eat is already a problem. And this map shows the likely situation in 2050 if there's no significant change in controlling fossil fuel emissions and if population growth continues as projected. Note that China and India, which account for a high proportion of the world's population, are both shown as having worsening problems, and the problems in Africa, already severe, have become catastrophic. Those of us fortunate enough to live in areas shown as gray on these maps will not be able to ignore hunger and famine, because people who can't find food are going to try to move to places where they can. The only way to avoid an impossible world refugee crisis will be to solve the food insufficiency problem in the places that need it. There are already programs to help agriculture in some of these places, but the scale is going to have to be much, much greater. The best way to reduce all of these issues is climate change mitigation, measures to slow and ultimately stop the course of climate change. There may still be time to do this, but the longer it takes to convince everyone what must be done, the harder the task will be. The main avenue to change has to be international agreement, and the recent Paris Accords have been an encouraging step, but it's only a step. Even if the Paris Accords are successfully carried out, which is far from certain, experts are saying that it won't keep global warming from going past 2 degrees Celsius, which is said to be the outer limit for any kind of safety. Other future agreements will also be needed. There isn't much that any of us can do about international agreements, but there is also a role for local government and for citizens acting locally. The measures that Larry and I are advocating in this course are all things that can be done locally, such as promoting environmental conservation, balancing transportation to use less fossil fuel, promoting compact, walkable communities to reduce energy consumption, and making the design of development that is climate-friendly more attractive so that people will choose it. While these measures won't stop climate change by themselves, they can go a long way towards helping if they become normal instead of exceptions. Have you seen signs of climate change where you live? If these changes are unfavorable, is there anything being done about them? What should be done? Larry and I will now go on to discuss using development regulations and local funding to implement our eco-design proposals, which have other good reasons for implementation in addition to their influence in mitigating climate change.